I found my name inside a box my husband had made sure I was never supposed to open. I had gone into Andrew's drafting studio that Saturday morning for the least dramatic reason imaginable. Our homeowner's insurance renewal was due, and I needed the folder containing the measurements and photographs from the renovation of our brick house in Pittsburgh. Andrew, my husband of 17 years, was already at his architecture office, and I knew he kept copies of the renovation documents on the lower shelves beside his reference books. His studio was usually the most orderly room in our house. Rolls of drawings stood upright in one corner, pencils were arranged beside his drafting table, and heavy books on residential design filled two wall shelves. I was reaching behind one of those books when I noticed a small wooden box pushed against the back of the shelf. I recognized it. I had seen it occasionally over the years, but Andrew had always treated it like storage for old work materials, and I had never had a reason to question that. What stopped me now was an envelope corner protruding beneath the lid. Written across it was one word I recognized instantly: Meredith. My own name. I pulled the box forward. It was locked. For several seconds, I simply stared at it, trying to imagine an innocent explanation for why something addressed to me would be locked inside Andrew's private box. Then I remembered the ring of small household keys Andrew kept in the top drawer, leftovers from old cabinets, storage cases, and years of renovations. I had used one of them before for the drafting cabinet, though I had no idea whether any belonged to the box. The first two did nothing. The third turned. The lid opened quietly. On top were several envelopes, all addressed to Meredith Lawson. None had been opened. Beneath them lay an old photograph. I picked it up and felt my stomach tighten. I was perhaps 8 years old in the picture, wearing a jacket I vaguely remembered, standing beside a man I had spent most of my adult life trying not to think about. My father, Harold. I had not seen him in decades. I set the photograph down and noticed several pages covered in Andrew's precise handwriting. As a public library archives coordinator, I spent my working life looking at dates, sequences, and provenance, so my eyes went automatically to the chronology before I absorbed the words. These were not random notes. Andrew had recorded dates beside Harold's name. Contact attempts. Letters received. Brief remarks about what had been said. I looked again at the unopened envelopes, then at the photograph, then at the handwriting I knew as well as my own. Until that moment, I had believed the unsettling part was simply that my husband had a secret box. But this box was not hiding Andrew's past. It was holding pieces of mine. I checked the date on the earliest note, expecting something recent that might at least explain why Andrew had not found the right moment to tell me. Instead, I read the year twice to make sure I had not misunderstood it. Andrew had first recorded contact from my father 3 years earlier. For a moment, I wanted to open the newest letter first. Whatever Harold had written most recently felt like it should contain the answer I needed. But years of working with archival records had taught me how easily a story could be distorted when you started at the end. I carried the box to Andrew's drafting table and began arranging everything by date. The earliest envelope matched the first entry in Andrew's notes from 3 years ago. Another envelope had arrived 4 months later. Then another the following spring. There were gaps between them, but the pattern was unmistakable. My father had not contacted Andrew once and disappeared. He had kept trying. I read Andrew's notes before touching the letters themselves. His handwriting was controlled and familiar, the same careful print he used when marking measurements on renovation plans. One entry recorded that Harold had found Andrew through his architecture firm and asked whether he was still married to me. Another showed that Harold had contacted him again after receiving no clear answer about whether I wanted communication. I stopped there. Andrew knew I had spent years believing my father had walked away and never seriously tried to come back. I had told him what that belief had done to me. I had also trusted him with those memories because he was my husband, not because I expected him to become their gatekeeper. The next note made that distinction impossible to ignore. Harold had mailed a letter specifically for me and asked Andrew to give it to me when Andrew believed the time was right. I looked at the corresponding envelope. My name was written across the front, not Andrew's. The seal was intact. Whatever Harold had wanted to say, Andrew had apparently never read it. Somehow that made me more unsettled, not less. He had not judged the contents and decided they would hurt me. He had judged the existence of the letter itself. I continued through the dates. Andrew had not destroyed anything. He had kept every envelope and recorded every contact with almost professional care. That told me he had understood these things mattered. Yet he had still placed them in a locked box and said nothing to me. By then, my first shock had hardened into something more precise. This was no longer about discovering that Andrew had kept a secret. It was about realizing he had made a decision concerning my father, my history, and information addressed directly to me. I did not open the letters yet. Before I heard Harold's explanation for the past, I needed Andrew's explanation for the present. I left the envelopes in chronological order across the drafting table, with his notes beside them. Late that afternoon, I heard Andrew's car pull into the driveway. A minute later the back door opened. He called my name from downstairs, sounding completely ordinary. I stayed beside the table. His footsteps came up the stairs and moved toward the studio. When Andrew reached the doorway, he stopped. His eyes went from me to the open wooden box, then to the envelopes arranged across his drafting table. I did not give him time to invent an easier version of what I had found. I looked directly at my husband and asked, "Why did you keep letters that had my name on them?" Andrew did not ask what I was talking about. He looked at the envelopes, then at me, and I watched the recognition settle across his face. "I should have told you," he said. "That is not what I asked." My voice was steadier than I felt. "Why did you keep them from me?" Andrew stepped into the studio but stopped several feet from the drafting table. He did not reach for the box or try to put anything away. "Your father contacted me 3 years ago through the firm. He said he had been trying to find a way to reach you without showing up unexpectedly. I waited. And you decided not to tell me." Andrew nodded. "Yes." There was no denial, and somehow that made the choice feel even more deliberate. He reminded me of conversations we had had years earlier, when I had told him how long it took me to stop expecting Harold to come back. I had told Andrew about birthdays when I watched the driveway, school events where I searched the audience, and the anger that eventually became easier to carry than hope. Andrew said that when Harold first appeared after decades of silence, he was afraid that simply handing me a letter would drag me back into all of it. "I thought you had finally made peace with him being gone," he said. I did not want someone else deciding whether that peace got taken away. I stared at him. "So you decided instead?" Andrew's expression changed. He had clearly heard the contradiction as soon as I said it. "I thought I was protecting you." "From a letter addressed to me?" He looked down at the envelopes. "At first, yes." Those 2 words mattered. At first? Andrew explained that Harold contacted him again months later, then again the following year. Each time Harold contacted him, Andrew told himself the same thing, that reopening the subject might do more harm than good. He kept every letter because destroying something addressed to me felt wrong, even while he continued convincing himself that silence was safer. I understood his reasoning without accepting it. That distinction surprised me. For 17 years, Andrew had been the person I trusted with things I rarely discussed with anyone else. Now I could see that he had taken that trust and stretched it beyond its proper boundary. He had not hidden another marriage, another life, or some financial betrayal. He had convinced himself that knowing my pain gave him the right to manage it. "Did you read them?" I asked. "No. They were addressed to you. But you decided whether I could receive them." Andrew did not argue. "Yes." The room became quiet. I looked at the earliest envelope. My father's handwriting was unfamiliar enough that I would not have recognized it without Andrew's notes. Until that afternoon, I had believed Harold had chosen absence and stayed absent. Now I knew he had reached out more than once, but I still did not know what he wanted from me. Andrew moved toward the door. "I will answer anything you ask, Meredith. But I think whatever is in those letters should come from him, not from me." For the first time since he came home, that sounded like a choice he was leaving to me. I sat at the drafting table and placed my hand on the oldest envelope. "Then I am starting with the first one," I said. I opened the oldest envelope carefully, more from habit than sentiment. At work, I handled fragile records every day, but my hands still felt strangely clumsy when the paper belonged to my own life. Harold began without asking me to forgive him. He wrote that leaving my mother had been his decision and that he knew the damage from that choice belonged partly to him. Then I reached a sentence that made me stop. He said leaving the marriage had never meant that he wanted to leave me. According to Harold, during the first few years after the separation, he had tried more than once to stay connected. I wanted to dismiss that immediately because it contradicted the version of my childhood I had carried for decades. But he mentioned things that were difficult to dismiss. He remembered a school concert when I was 9 and described the blue paper stars taped behind the stage. I remembered those stars. More importantly, I remembered scanning the folding chairs before the concert began because some part of me had hoped he might appear. Harold wrote that he had been there, near the back, but left before I could see him because an argument with my mother in the lobby convinced him his presence would make the evening worse. That did not make him heroic. If anything, it frustrated me. He had been close enough to see me and had still chosen to leave. But it was not the same as never coming. In another letter, he mentioned a birthday gift he had mailed when I turned 11, a small wooden music box with painted flowers. I remembered receiving it, though I had never known who sent it. Harold's description of the painted flowers matched the box I remembered. I put the letter down and looked toward the photograph from Andrew's box. It showed Harold and me together years earlier, before the divorce had reduced our family history to 2 competing versions. Andrew remained downstairs. He had not come back to defend himself or ask what I was reading, and I was grateful for the space. I opened the next letter. Harold's account did not suddenly make everything I remembered false. He admitted missing visits. He admitted that after arguments with my mother, he sometimes waited too long before trying again. He admitted that shame made avoidance easier. Those admissions were precisely what made the rest harder to ignore. He was not presenting himself as the father who had done everything right. He was saying that the simple story I had believed, that he walked away once and never looked back, was incomplete. By the time I reached the later letters, my anger at Andrew had not disappeared, but it had been joined by something less comfortable. For years, I had built part of my identity around knowing exactly why my father was absent. Now I was confronting the possibility that I had known only the outcome, not everything that produced it. Near the end of one letter, Harold described the moment his attempts became less frequent. My mother, Elaine, had asked him to step back. According to Harold, she believed the repeated uncertainty was hurting me more than his absence would. I read that passage twice. Learning who had asked him to stay away answered one question immediately, but it created a harder one. Why had 2 parents who both claimed to care about me concluded that losing one of them was the safer choice? The letters that followed made my mother's decision harder to reduce to either cruelty or kindness. I sat with that for a long moment, not because I suddenly believed she had lied to me about everything, but because Harold's account sounded painfully more complicated than that. He wrote that after the divorce, every attempted visit seemed to leave me waiting for adults to finish arguing. Sometimes he arrived late. Sometimes plans changed. Sometimes my mother and father disagreed about where or when I should be picked up. According to Harold, Elaine eventually told him that I was becoming anxious before visits and devastated when plans failed. She believed a clean break would hurt less than repeated disappointment. Harold wrote that he disagreed at first, but he also knew he had contributed to the instability. Instead of finding a better way to remain present, he backed away. He told himself that respecting Elaine's request was the responsible choice. Reading that made me angry with both of them for different reasons. My mother had been raising a confused child while dealing with the end of her marriage. I could understand why predictability might have seemed more important than preserving a relationship that kept producing disappointment. But she had also helped shape the story I grew up believing. Harold, meanwhile, had allowed shame and conflict to turn retreat into a habit. He had not been forced to disappear completely. He had made choices too. There was no clean villain in those pages, and that was harder to process than discovering one would have been. I thought about the music box, the school concert, and all the years when I had translated silence into certainty. Then another connection became impossible to ignore. My mother had decided that knowing less about my father's attempts would protect me from disappointment. Harold had decided that stepping back would protect me from conflict. Decades later, Andrew had looked at the same old wound and made his own version of the same decision. 3 people who cared about me had reached different conclusions at different times, yet each had assumed that protecting me gave them permission to choose what I should know. I went downstairs and found Andrew at the kitchen table. He looked up but did not ask what the letters said. "I understand more now about why you were afraid to give them to me," I said. "But understanding it does not make it acceptable." Andrew nodded. I told him that whatever came next with Harold would be my decision. If another letter arrived, if Harold called, or if anyone contacted Andrew about something that belonged to my history, Andrew was to tell me. He was not to evaluate whether I was ready first. "You are right," he said. There was no defense attached to it. No explanation about good intentions. Just an acknowledgement of the boundary he had crossed. That did not restore my trust, but it changed the conversation. I was no longer waiting for Andrew to decide what happened next. I returned upstairs and looked at the remaining letters. One question still mattered. After all those years of stepping away, why had Harold started trying again? This time, I would decide whether I wanted the answer. I returned to Andrew's studio and opened the most recent envelope. Harold's tone was different from the earlier letters. He was not trying to explain the divorce again or persuade me that my memories were wrong. Instead, he wrote that getting older had forced him to recognize how much time he had wasted waiting for circumstances to feel easier. He had spent years telling himself that contacting me might disrupt my life, and eventually he understood that this was another decision he was making on my behalf. That was why he had started trying again. He did not ask Andrew to convince me to forgive him. He did not ask for my address or suggest appearing at our home. He wrote that he wanted me to know one thing: if I ever had questions about what happened, he was willing to answer them honestly, even if the answers made him look worse. Whether I contacted him afterward was entirely my choice. I read those lines twice. Then I went back through Andrew's notes until I found the entry corresponding to that letter. Andrew had recorded receiving it. He had also written that Harold was not requesting direct contact. That detail changed something important. 3 years earlier, Andrew could at least tell himself that he was protecting me from a man whose intentions he did not understand. By the time this letter arrived, Harold had made his intentions clear. He was offering information, not demanding reconciliation. Yet the envelope had still gone into the box. I found Andrew downstairs and asked him why. This time he did not repeat what he had said before. He sat quietly for several seconds before answering. "Because by then, telling you meant telling you everything else too." He admitted that the longer he kept the first letter, the harder it became to confess what he had done. Each new attempt from Harold gave Andrew another chance to correct the original decision, but it also increased what he would have to explain. "I kept telling myself I was protecting you," he said. "Eventually, I was also protecting myself from having to admit that I had made the choice for you." That admission hurt more than another defense would have. It also gave me the first completely honest explanation I had heard since opening the box. Andrew had begun with fear for me, but his secrecy had survived partly because revealing it threatened the way I trusted him. I told him I needed time before I could decide what that meant for our marriage. He said he understood. I went upstairs alone and gathered every envelope, the photograph, and the pages that concerned Harold. I did not put them back into Andrew's wooden box. I carried them to my own desk and placed them together in a folder. At the bottom of Harold's most recent letter was a mailing address, a telephone number, and a simple request that I use either only if I wanted to. For the first time in decades, there was a clear path between my father and me, and nobody else needed to stand in the middle of it. I closed the folder and kept it with me. For the next 2 days, I did not call Harold. I also did not ask Andrew what he thought I should do. That distinction mattered to me. I wanted the next decision to belong entirely to me, but I also wanted to know whether I was making it from facts or from the emotional force of letters I had only just discovered. At the library, I spend much of my working life separating records from interpretations, so I applied the same discipline to my own history. I checked what I could without turning the process into an investigation of everyone I loved. An old school program. Confirmed the date of the concert Harold had described. In a box of childhood belongings I had kept for years, I found the wooden music box with painted flowers. I had almost forgotten it existed. There was no surviving card to establish who had sent it, but the object matched Harold's description exactly. I also compared several dates in his letters with family records I already had. They lined up. None of that proved every memory Harold had written was accurate, and it certainly did not erase the years when he was absent. Taken together, those details gave his account enough credibility that I could no longer dismiss it simply because it challenged the story I had grown up with. That evening, I sat at my desk with his latest letter in front of me. Andrew was downstairs. He knew what I was considering, but he did not come upstairs to influence the decision. I appreciated that, even though appreciation was not the same as restored trust. Harold had included both an address and a telephone number. Writing would have given me more control, but I realized I did not want another letter sitting between us. I wanted to ask a question and hear how he answered it. So I picked up my phone and entered the number. Before calling, I decided what this contact did and did not mean. It did not mean forgiveness. It did not mean reconciliation. It did not mean I had chosen Harold's version over my mother's. It meant only that I was choosing to hear him for myself. I pressed the call button. The line rang long enough for me to wonder whether the number was still current. Then a man answered. His voice was older than anything stored in my memory. I asked whether I was speaking to Harold. There was a pause before he said yes. "This is Meredith." The silence that followed was not dramatic. It sounded like someone trying to find the right response after waiting years for a moment he had no right to expect. He did not launch into an apology or explain himself before I could speak. He said he was glad I had called and that I could ask him anything I wanted. I looked at the photograph on my desk and knew exactly where I needed to begin. "I need to understand something," I said. "If you wanted to be my father, why did you stop fighting to stay in my life?" For another moment, Harold said nothing. Then I heard him take a slow breath. When he finally spoke, he did not offer an excuse. "Meredith," he said. I stopped because I was ashamed, and because stepping away became easier than admitting how badly I had handled everything. The answer landed harder because Harold did not soften it or shift responsibility elsewhere. He did not blame my mother. He said Elaine had asked him to give me stability after too many plans ended in disappointment, but agreeing to step back had still been his choice. "I told myself I was doing what was best for you," he said. "The truth is, I was also avoiding conflict I did not know how to handle." I thought about Andrew admitting almost the same thing for a different reason. Both men had begun by claiming they wanted to protect me, and both had eventually allowed their own discomfort to influence decisions that should have included me. Harold told me he could have fought harder to remain present. He could have written more consistently. When enough years passed, embarrassment became another obstacle. He kept imagining that the next month would somehow be a better time to try again. Eventually he understood that waiting for the perfect moment was simply another form of doing nothing. "The letters were not meant to convince you that I was a good father," he said. "I was not asking Andrew to bring you back to me. I wanted you to have the option to ask me what happened before there was no longer an opportunity." Hearing that did not repair my childhood. It did something more useful. It replaced a simple explanation with an honest one. Harold had loved me, failed me, regretted it, and still lacked the right to decide what those facts should mean to me now. I told him I was not ready to call what we were doing reconciliation. He said he understood. I also told him I wanted another conversation after I had time to process this one. Before we ended the call, I gave him my mailing address and told him he could write if he wanted, with the understanding that I would decide when or whether to read anything he sent. His answer was simply, "Whenever you choose." When the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes before going downstairs. Andrew was in the kitchen. He looked at me, but instead of asking what Harold had said, he asked, "What do you need from me?" That question mattered because it was different from every decision that had brought us here. "I need you not to manage this for me," I said. "I am going to speak with him again. I do not know what kind of relationship that will become, if any. I need you to let me decide that." Andrew nodded. "I will." I told him Harold had admitted his failures without trying to rewrite the past. Then I told Andrew something equally important. "I understand why you were afraid those letters would hurt me. I may eventually forgive the choice you made because of that fear. But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing." His face tightened, but he did not defend himself. "I know." For the first time since I opened the box, there was no central question I still needed Andrew to answer. I understood why Harold said he had stepped away, why he had returned, and why Andrew had kept that return from me. What remained could not be solved by another letter. Andrew would have to show me, over time, that he understood the difference between loving me and choosing for me. A few weeks later, the house felt familiar again, but not unchanged. Harold and I had spoken 3 more times. The conversations were careful and sometimes uncomfortable, yet neither of us tried to force them into something they were not. I still did not know whether he would ever feel like my father in the way I once wished he had. For now, he was a man from my past whom I had chosen to allow into a small part of my present. That was enough. Andrew and I were changing too. We stayed married, but I did not pretend one honest conversation had repaired 17 years of trust after discovering a secret he had maintained for 3 of them. What mattered was what happened afterward. When Harold mailed another letter, Andrew saw my name on the envelope and placed it unopened beside my coffee cup. He did not ask whether I wanted to read it. He did not warn me about what it might contain. He simply said, "This came for you." That small moment meant more to me than another apology could have. Andrew was learning that supporting me did not require managing me. I was learning something about myself as well. For years, I had treated my childhood as a closed room in our marriage. I had told Andrew enough to understand the pain, but I had also made it clear that I rarely wanted the subject touched. I could see how that silence had contributed to his fear of reopening it. It did not excuse what he did. There was still a difference between respecting a boundary and secretly deciding what information another person could receive. But understanding my part in the way we communicated helped us build a clearer boundary going forward. If something belonged to my history, I would decide whether to face it. If Andrew was worried about me, he could tell me he was worried. He could stand beside me without standing between me and the truth. One Saturday morning, I walked into his drafting studio and noticed the wooden box back on the shelf. It was unlocked now. Inside were a few old architecture sketches, spare drafting tools, and receipts Andrew wanted to keep. Nothing belonging to me remained there. Harold's letters were in a folder at my own desk, where I could read them or leave them closed according to my own choice. That ordinary little box became the most tangible evidence that something in our marriage had shifted. Andrew had given up a kind of authority he should never have assumed, and I had stopped waiting for other people to explain my own history to me. I had not rewritten my childhood. Harold had still failed me. From what I could piece together, Elaine had made choices she believed would protect a struggling child. Andrew had made another version of that mistake decades later. None of them became villains once I understood more, and none of them became innocent either. The unexpected part was realizing how similar their choices had been. Each person had loved me in some way, and each had confused love with deciding what I could handle. For the first time, I could see the pattern clearly enough to refuse to continue it. Harold. And I would build whatever relationship was possible one conversation at a time. Andrew and I would rebuild trust the same way. There would be no dramatic promise that everything was fixed. There would simply be choices, made openly this time, by the people whose lives those choices actually belonged to. Sometimes the hardest truths do not destroy a relationship or restore it. They simply change its shape. Perhaps trust is less about returning to the way things were and more about learning whether something more honest can be built in its place. Understanding why someone made a painful choice may soften anger without erasing the consequence, just as forgiveness can begin long before confidence fully returns. There are moments when family history becomes easier to carry, not because every question receives a perfect answer, but because we finally have the freedom to decide what those answers mean for us. I could not recover the years I had lost with Harold or undo Andrew's decision. What I could recover was ownership of what came next. Sometimes that quiet return of choice is not a dramatic ending at all. It is simply where a healthier relationship gets the chance to begin. If you had been in my position, how would you have responded to Andrew, and what kind of relationship, if any, would you have chosen to build with Harold after learning the truth?